This is going to be interesting, viewers. Marie grew up in a strict Catholic household, rebelled as a teenager, and spent years living the clubbing and drinking lifestyle. She wasn't looking for religion. Then October 7th happened. Well, let's see what's going on with Marie.
Well, I think I've kind of watched quite a few revert stories over the last couple of years, maybe 3 years now. And mine is similar to quite a few others that I've sort of watched online. It really started with the kickoff with the 7th of October in Palestine. And obviously I was watching the news. It all started kicking off there. There was just something that didn't quite add up for me. I wasn't sure what it was. And so I started to go on to Instagram, looked at Al Jazeera, and fairly quickly realized that what I was seeing was not really what was happening.
Viewers, a careful psychological assessment would distinguish between understanding why somebody justifies October 7th and predicting whether they would personally participate in the violence. And these things are related. If you can justify October 7th, then in a way you're insinuating that you would have participated. But they're not exactly the same thing. The Jewish victim perspective. A psychological analysis is incomplete unless it includes the perspective of the victims. For many Jewish people, October 7 was not experienced as an abstract geographical event. It was experienced as families murdered in homes, children killed, civilians kidnapped, women assaulted, elderly people attacked and mutilated, concert attendees hunted and murdered and raped. And from that perspective, the event's not primarily interpreted as resistance. It's interpreted as terrorism, massacre, trauma, victimization, existential threat. And the psychological question from the victim side becomes, how could someone watch this happen and still call it justified? And that question's emotionally and morally significant because the victims are not experiencing the event as an historical theory. They're experiencing it as a direct human assault. It's just a direct human demise, catastrophe. Does justifying October 7 mean someone would participate? Not necessarily, but psychologically recognizes several levels. Level 1, moral approval. A person believes the act was justified. Level 2, sympathy, emotional sympathy. A person feels emotionally aligned with the perpetrators. Level 3, passive support. A person advocates for or excuses the action. Level 4, active support. A person materially assists or encourages the action. And then level 5, personal participation. A person's willing to personally engage in violence. And many people stop at level 1 or 2, but they may justify violence abstractly while never personally committing it. So history shows this repeatedly. People often support wars, revolutions, or violent movements that they would never personally participate in. So the important psychological warning here is the concern's not if they justify October 7, they must be a terrorist as per se. The conclusion would be unwarranted. The deeper concern is what moral transformation occurred that made deliberate violence against civilians appear acceptable. And that transformation may involve tribal identity replacing universal effects, moral disengagement, dehumanization, ideological immersion, grievance-based justification, emotional fusion with a cause. These mechanisms do not automatically produce violence, but they do reduce moral resistance to the violence. The victim reversal test. One useful psychological test is, would this person still justify the event if the victims were their own family or themselves? If the answer changes depending on who the victims are, that suggests tribal morality rather than universal morality is governing the judgment. And that does not prove malicious intent. It reveals an important moral inconsistency. The combined psychological profile. If a person simultaneously abandons a previously held faith commitment, adapts a radically different ideological identity, becomes sympathetic toward terrorist violence, embraces increasingly oppositional worldviews, and pursues intoxication, impulsivity, or high-risk behavior, a psychologist might ask, is this a genuine search for truth, or is it part of a broader identity reconstruction process? And the central question becomes, what need is being met? Possibilities include belonging, rebellion, certainty, purpose, community, significance, emotional intensity, opposition to a previous identity. Those motivations do not automatically make the new beliefs false, but they are important to examine because people often change worldviews for psychological reasons before they fully examine them exactly. The bottom line assessment. A person who justifies October 7 has crossed a significant moral threshold. They have concluded that deliberate violence in its highest degree against civilians can be morally acceptable under certain conditions. And that conclusion does not automatically mean they would personally participate in terrorism. However, it does indicate that some moral barrier against such violence has already been weakened, modified, or reframed within their thinking. And from both a victim-centered perspective and a Christian ethical perspective, the deeper question is not merely which side are you on, but what principle allows the intentional targeting of civilians to become morally acceptable in the first place?
That there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of lies and a lot of cover-ups. That became apparent to me quite quickly. So I started following lots of journalists in the field, and
basically what she's saying is October 7th didn't happen the way that it happened. And she's gone cognitive dissonant.
Started to read lots about what was going on in Palestine, but also in the Middle East in general. And I just became very, very super interested in it. And why was there so much cover up and propaganda that was going on? So I just started reading. I bought books. I started, digging quite in depth into the history of what was happening. Realised that it had been going on for a very long time, for decades and decades, 78 years now. And yeah, I bought a Quran because I just felt that I became interested in what was going on in Palestine, but I became really super interested in the people, and everything about them really. And one thing that struck me was their deep faith, and how that seemed to be the most important thing to them. And I was just fascinated by it all. So I bought a Quran and I started reading it. And again, I just thought, this isn't what the West portrays it to be. I did a little tiny bit about Islam at school, many many years ago, but that was a long time ago. But I didn't really remember much about it, and so I felt like I didn't really know much about Islam at all. But I didn't really remember much about it, and so I felt like I didn't really know much about Islam at all. So I started reading the Quran. I went straight to the chapter on women, and thought, well, where's the oppression? Where's all this? What the West says Islam is? I don't see any of that.
Viewers, whether the Quran contains oppression of women depends heavily on the framework being used. Many Muslim scholars argue that the Quran, number one, improved women's status compared with the 7th century Arabia. 2, granted inheritance rights. 3, restricted some pre-Islamic practices. 4, recognized women as moral and spiritual agents before God. 5, established rights in marriage and divorce. And from this perspective, the Quran is viewed as protective rather than oppressive. But the critical perspective argues that certain Quran passages and later Islamic legal traditions create unequal treatment between men and women. Commonly cited examples include inheritance. Quran 4:11, a son generally receives a larger inheritance share than a daughter. Critics view this as unequal treatment. Supporters argue it reflects differing financial obligations placed on men. In terms of testimony, Quran 2:82 says, in a specific financial context, 2 women may substitute for 1 male witness. Critics see this as an unequal evidentiary status. Supporters argue it was in the context specific and not universal rule. Husbands and wives, Quran 4:34. This is among the most debated of passages. It describes men as maintainers of women and contains language regarding dealing with marital disobedience. Some traditional interpretations allow a form of physical discipline, and many modern Muslim scholars dispute or heavily qualify those interpretations, but critics frequently cite this verse as evidence of female subordination. Polygamy, Quran 4:3, permits a man to have up to 4 wives under certain conditions. Women do not receive an equivalent right. Critics view this as unequal, and supporters argue that the practice was regulated and restricted compared with pre-Islamic customs. Muhammad's recorded as having 11 wives or more. Leadership and authority. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence often developed male guardianship structures from Quranic and prophetic sources. Critics argue these systems can restrict female autonomy. Supporters argue the system establishes complementary rather than unequal roles. And so the psychological and behavioural question is, a separate question is, how do these texts function when implemented socially? Well, there's often a difference between the Quranic text itself, the classical Islamic jurisprudence, local cultural practice, and modern state law. Some Muslim majority societies provide substantial rights and opportunities for women. Others impose significant restrictions like dress, movement, education, employment, divorce, testimony, and custody. And critics often argue these restrictions are rooted partly in religious interpretation, but supporters often argue they result from culture, politics, or selective interpretation rather than the Quran itself.
And
well, if she can't see in the Islamic writings the oppression of women, that's a deliberate choice not to.
I felt like my mind had been blown because, you have all these ideas about what Islam is, about what Muslims are, and I'd had my eyes opened and my mind opened, and I thought, this isn't what the West says it is at all. And I just became more and more intrigued. I was brought up a Catholic. My mother was very, very strict Catholic, so I was brought up in a very religious.
I can assure you, strict Catholicism is a Sunday picnic compared to strict Islamist
family. So, and I always had a Bible next to my bed. I remember my mother taking me to mass and things like that as a child. As a teenager, I did rebel, and I wasn't interested in any of that. Don't want to know. I just want to go out to clubs and drink alcohol and and dance and stuff like that. And that's what I did for many years.
And have wild sex and all the rest of it. Exactly what the Islamists tell you not to do, exactly what Christianity advises you not to do.
Haven't touched alcohol in 4 years. So I actually had given up drinking alcohol long before I even discovered Islam.
Oh, that's a downer, because they like you to attribute your life becoming better through Islam. She just denied that.
And I felt like I wasn't looking for it, but there was some sort of, I just felt like really pulled into it. A real pull towards Islam, and I just felt that that it was the right path somehow, and that something was source. I was being guided into that.
At this point, viewers, a deep question begins emerging. Not why did this person become Muslim, but what else changed at the same time? Because conversion alone does not automatically explain sympathy for violence, hostility toward former beliefs, or changes in moral judgment. The more important question may be, was this a theological conclusion, or was it part of a larger identity transformation already underway relative to trying to find stability? The conflict being the fact that she chose Islam rather than Christianity, which is her choice. But do you think it was the right choice?
That's kind of my revert story, and I'm here in the north of England now, and hopefully continue to learn. I feel I have much to learn about Islam.
Viewers, if her conversion to Islam relative to October 7th, for the families affected by October 7th, this is not primarily a political or religious theory. It's personal. Parents lost children, children lost parents, families lost loved ones lost families. So when someone begins justifying what happened, the victims often hear something deeper than political disagreement. They hear, my suffering no longer matters. And that's why the emotional response is often so intense. The debate is no longer abstract. It becomes human. And this woman is inspired to turn to Islam via October 7th.
And still reading the Quran. I've read it once. I'm starting to read it again, and yeah, that's my story really. Alhamdulillah, I found Islam through something that wasn't something that's horrendous, but
It was psychologically the most revealing question may not be, did this person change religions? The more revealing question may be, what happened to their moral boundaries? Because once violence against civilians becomes morally acceptable, something significant has shifted. The issue is no longer simply identity. The issue is moral consistency. Would the same standard apply if the victims were their own family, or their own children, their own community? And that question often exposes whether a person is operating from universal morality or tribal morality, or some deeper psychological issue. And that distinction may reveal more than the conversion to Islam itself.
but that's what happened for me anyway.
Perhaps the most revealing fact is not that the person became Muslim. It is that alongside the transformation came growing sympathy for violence against civilians, increasing tolerance toward immorality, and a willingness to excuse behaviours that once would have been morally unthinkable. At that point, the question is no longer what religion did they join. The question becomes, what does immorality now feel? Why does immorality now feel more acceptable than it once did? Because every belief system ultimately reveals itself by what it teaches people to love, defend, excuse, and become. And on October 7, Islam revealed exactly how it feels and what its belief system is.